Prairie Horizons by Weston Ford. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs as Eliza Morgan stepped down from the stagecoach. Her legs, stiff from the 3-day journey, nearly buckled beneath her as her boots touched Wyoming soil for the first time. She straightened her spine, adjusted her simple blue traveling dress, and breathed in the unfamiliar scent of sage and pine that permeated the air. "First time in the territory, miss?" The stagecoach driver handed down her weathered leather trunk. "Is it that obvious?" Eliza tucked a wayward strand of auburn hair beneath her bonnet. The driver chuckled. "Folks round here don't usually wear clothes quite so Eastern." He tipped his hat and climbed back onto his perch. Eliza glanced down at her attire, suddenly conscious of how out of place she must appear. The few women visible on the boardwalks wore practical calico dresses, their hair simply styled, faces tanned by the western sun. Her gaze swept across the collection of wooden buildings that comprised Cottonwood Springs, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various businesses whose purposes she could only guess at. "You need help with that trunk, miss?" The deep voice startled her. Eliza turned to find herself facing a tall man whose broad shoulders nearly blocked the sun. His face, partially shadowed by the brim of a well-worn hat, bore the weathered look of someone who spent most of his days outdoors. Yet there was a gentleness in his blue eyes that contrasted with his rugged appearance. "Thank you, but I can manage." Her voice emerged stronger than she felt. One corner of his mouth lifted in the slightest of smiles. "I've no doubt of that. But a gentleman offers assistance to a lady regardless." Without waiting for her response, he hefted the trunk with ease. "Name's Jackson Reed. Most folks call me Jax." "Eliza Morgan. Where you headed, Miss Morgan?" Eliza retrieved a folded paper from her reticule. "The Diamond R Ranch. My brother Thomas works there as a horse trainer." Something flickered across Jackson's face, recognition, perhaps surprise. "Diamond R is my spread, miss. Tom's a good man, best hand with horses I've seen in these parts." He studied her with newfound interest. "He never mentioned a sister coming to visit." "He doesn't know." Eliza's hands twisted nervously at her skirts. "Our parents passed last winter. There's nothing left for me in Pennsylvania now." Jackson's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." He glanced at the sky, already beginning to deepen toward evening. "The ranch is a fair ride from town. You're welcome to stay at the hotel tonight, start fresh in the morning. I've come this far. I'd prefer to complete my journey today if possible." Jackson nodded, seeming to approve of her determination. "My wagon's just down the street. I need to collect a few supplies, then we can be on our way." The journey to Diamond R Ranch took nearly 2 hours along a rutted trail that went through rolling grasslands and scattered pine forests. Jackson drove the wagon with steady hands, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local knowledge. Eliza found herself stealing glances at his profile, the strong jaw dusted with stubble, the straight nose, the laugh lines that appeared when he smiled. "You own this entire ranch yourself?" she asked as they crested a hill that revealed a sprawling landscape below. "Going on 5 years now. Bought it from the old owner when he decided to retire to Denver." Pride resonated in his voice. "Started with just a few head of cattle and a dream. Now we've got one of the most promising herds in the territory. That's quite an accomplishment." "Had my share of setbacks." His hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Lost nearly half my herd in the blizzard of '76. Then there was the drought 2 summers back." He glanced at her. "But out here you learn to weather what comes. The strong survive, the weak move on." As they approached the ranch, Eliza caught sight of several buildings nestled in a valley alongside a winding creek. A large 2-story house stood as the centerpiece, surrounded by a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Men moved about the property, tending to end-of-day chores. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Home," Jackson replied simply. A familiar figure emerged from the barn, leading a chestnut mare. Even from a distance, Eliza recognized her brother's lanky frame and easy gait. Her pulse quickened with anticipation. Thomas looked up as the wagon approached, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to joy in rapid succession. "Eliza," he called out, handing the horse's reins to another worker and striding toward them. Jackson barely had time to stop the wagon before Eliza was scrambling down, rushing into her brother's outstretched arms. Thomas lifted her off her feet in a fierce embrace that spoke volumes of their separation. "What in heaven's name are you doing here?" Thomas asked when he finally set her down, his hand still gripping her shoulders as if afraid she might disappear. "It's a long story," she said, suddenly aware of the curious stares from the ranch hands, who had paused in their work to observe the reunion. Thomas seemed to notice their audience as well. "Boss," he acknowledged Jackson with a respectful nod. "I see you've met my sister. I found her stepping off the stage in town." Jackson climbed down from the wagon. "She's got your stubborn streak, insisted on coming straight out rather than waiting till morning." Thomas laughed. "That sounds like Eliza." He squeezed her shoulders gently. "But you should have written ahead. I'd have come to town to meet you." Before Eliza could respond, a woman's voice called from the direction of the house. "Jackson, is that you?" A slender blonde woman in a practical brown dress approached, her curious gaze taking in the scene. "Sarah," Jackson greeted her. "This is Miss Eliza Morgan, Tom's sister from back east. Miss Morgan, this is Sarah Wilson, our housekeeper." Sarah's welcoming smile transformed her plain features. "What a lovely surprise. We've heard so much about you from Thomas." She turned to Jackson. "I'll prepare the guest room right away." "No need to trouble yourself," Eliza began, but Thomas interrupted. "Where else would you stay?" "Unless you're planning to leave tomorrow?" His expression grew concerned. Eliza hesitated. "Actually, I was hoping to stay. Permanently." A moment of silence followed her announcement. It was Jackson who broke it. "Well then," he said, his tone matter of fact, "we'd best get you settled in. Sarah, show Miss Morgan to the blue room. Tom, help me with these supplies, then you can catch up with your sister over supper." As Sarah led her toward the house, Eliza couldn't help glancing back at Jackson. He was already deep in conversation with Thomas, but for a brief moment, their eyes met across the yard. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or the first tentative thread of connection. Days at Diamond R Ranch followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. Eliza woke each morning to the sounds of men readying for the day's work. Boots on wooden floors, quiet conversation, the clink of spurs and tack. She quickly established her own place in this new world, assisting Sarah with household duties and taking charge of the kitchen garden, which had been sadly neglected. Thomas introduced her to ranch life with brotherly patience, teaching her to ride astride rather than side saddle. "No Eastern nonsense out here, Liza," showing her the proper way to approach the horses, and explaining the complexities of cattle ranching until her head spun with new terminology. Jackson Reed remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite whenever their paths crossed, inquiring after her comfort, and occasionally joining her and Thomas for evening meals. But he maintained a careful distance that both frustrated and intrigued her. "Your boss doesn't speak much," she remarked to Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. Thomas chuckled. "Jax? He talks plenty when there's something worth saying. Man didn't build all this by wasting breath. He seems lonely." Thomas gave her a sharp look. "He's had his share of troubles. Lost his wife and daughter to fever before coming west. Don't think he's ever really gotten past it." The knowledge settled like a stone in Eliza's chest. "I didn't know. Not something he discusses." Thomas stretched his long legs before him. "Just don't go getting any ideas, Liza. Jax is a good man, best I've ever worked for, but he sealed that part of himself off a long time ago." Eliza felt her cheeks warm. "I wasn't getting ideas, as you put it. I was merely making an observation." Thomas's skeptical expression said he didn't believe her for a moment. Summer progressed, bringing long days of intense heat and occasional violent thunderstorms that rolled across the prairie with magnificent fury. Eliza found herself adapting to the rhythm of Western life more easily than she'd expected. Her hands, once soft from indoor living, grew calloused and capable. Her skin darkened beneath the Wyoming sun, and she abandoned her restrictive Eastern garments for practical dresses and sturdy boots. One sweltering afternoon, while Sarah was in town visiting a friend, Eliza decided to bring cold lemonade to the men working in the south pasture. She rode the gentle mare Thomas had selected for her, a basket secured to the saddle. She found Jackson alone, mending a section of fence. His shirt clung to his back, darkened with sweat, as he drove posts into the unyielding ground. He didn't notice her approach until her shadow fell across him. Looking up, he removed his hat and wiped his brow with his forearm. "Miss Morgan, I thought you might appreciate something cold to drink." She dismounted awkwardly, still not entirely comfortable with the Western style of riding, and offered him a glass of lemonade. His fingers brushed hers as he accepted it, sending an unexpected shiver through her despite the heat. "Thank you kindly." Jackson drank deeply, his throat working with each swallow. When he finished, he looked at her with a curiosity that hadn't been there before. "You're settling in well." It wasn't a question, but Eliza answered anyway. "Better than I expected. It's different from Pennsylvania in every way imaginable, but there's something honest about this place." "Honest," he repeated, seeming to test the word. "That's a good way to put it. The land doesn't lie to you out here. It's hard but fair in its way." Eliza poured herself a glass and leaned against the fence post, surveying the landscape that stretched to the distant mountains. "Thomas told me about your wife and daughter. I'm sorry for your loss." Jackson stiffened almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice had cooled. "Tom talks too much. He cares about you, we both do." The words slipped out before she could consider their implications. Jackson's gaze sharpened on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. For a moment, she thought he might say something significant, something that would shift the careful balance they'd maintained. Instead, he handed her the empty glass. "Best get back to work. Daylight's wasting." He turned away, effectively dismissing her. Eliza stood a moment longer, feeling as though something precious had slipped through her fingers. "Of course. Good day, Mr. Reed." She rode back to the house with her shoulders straight and her eyes stinging with unshed tears. August brought the cattle drive, a chaotic time when most of the ranch hands were away, moving the herd to market in Cheyenne. The house felt eerily quiet with just Eliza, Sarah, and two older hands who remained behind to guard the property. On the 5th day after the men's departure, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up, bending the tall grasses and sending loose items skittering across the yard. "Storm's coming," Sarah observed as they hastened to bring in the laundry from the clothesline. A bad one, by the look of it. They had just secured the last of the windows when the first massive drops began to fall. Within minutes, the rain was coming down in blinding sheets, driven sideways by gusting wind. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The horses, Eliza suddenly realized. Thomas said several new mares were due to foal this week. "They're in the south pasture." Sarah grabbed her arm. "You can't go out in this. The men will see to it when they return." "That could be days from now." Eliza pulled free, already moving toward the door. "I'll just check on them quickly." Before Sarah could protest further, Eliza had donned her brother's old slicker and was out the door, staggering against the force of the wind. The rain struck her face like tiny needles as she made her way to the barn, where she quickly saddled her mare. The horse was reluctant, rolling her eyes at the storm's fury, but Eliza managed to coax her out. The ride to the south pasture was harrowing. Twice, lightning struck so close that Eliza could smell the scorched earth. The normally placid creek had swollen into a roaring torrent that threatened to overflow its banks. Still, she pressed on, squinting against the deluge. She found the mares huddled beneath a stand of cottonwoods, their tails to the wind. None appeared to be in distress, though they snorted nervously at her approach. Eliza counted them quickly, 5, just as Thomas had said. Relief flooded through her. The relief was short-lived. As she turned to leave, a blinding flash and deafening crack split the air simultaneously. One of the massive cottonwoods, struck by lightning, began to topple directly toward the panicked horses. Eliza didn't stop to think. She spurred her mare forward, shouting and waving her arms to scatter the pregnant mares away from the falling tree. They bolted just in time, disappearing into the curtain of rain as the cottonwood crashed to earth with a sound like the end of the world. The violent motion spooked Eliza's own mount. The mare reared, eyes wild with terror, and Eliza felt herself sliding from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs, and rolled instinctively away from the horse's panicked hooves. For several moments she lay stunned in the mud, rain pelting her face. When she tried to stand, a sharp pain shot through her ankle. Gritting her teeth, she pulled herself upright, using a nearby tree for support. Her mare was nowhere to be seen. "Wonderful," she muttered, testing her weight on the injured ankle. It held, barely, sending spikes of pain up her leg with each step. The ranch house was at least a mile away, across increasingly treacherous terrain. She had made it perhaps a quarter of that distance when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Through the gray veil of rain appeared a familiar broad-shouldered silhouette. "Eliza," Jackson's voice carried above the storm as he dismounted and strode toward her. His expression was a mixture of relief and fury. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" "The mares," she explained, suddenly lightheaded. "I was worried about the foals." "So you decided to risk your life in the worst storm of the season?" He gripped her shoulders, his face inches from hers. "Have you lost your mind?" "Probably," she admitted, swaying slightly. "My ankle." The anger in his face gave way to concern. Without another word, he swept her into his arms and carried her to his horse. The world tilted alarmingly as he lifted her into the saddle. then mounted behind her, one arm securing her firmly against his chest. "Hold on," he ordered, his breath warm against her ear. The ride back seemed both eternal and instantaneous. Eliza was acutely aware of Jackson's solid presence behind her, the strength in the arm that held her, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them. By the time they reached the ranch house, her clothes were plastered to her skin, and she was shivering uncontrollably. Sarah met them at the door, her face pale with worry. "Thank the Lord. I sent one of the boys to find you as soon as I realized where she'd gone." Jackson carried Eliza inside and set her gently on the sofa near the fire. "Get her out of those wet clothes. I'll fetch the doctor." "No need," Eliza protested through chattering teeth. "It's just a sprain." Nevertheless, his tone brooked no argument. While Jackson rode for the doctor, Sarah helped Eliza change into dry clothes and wrapped her ankle tightly with strips of cloth. By the time they returned, Eliza was propped up on the sofa with blankets and a cup of hot tea. The doctor confirmed her self-diagnosis, a sprain, not a break, and left her with strict instructions to stay off the foot for at least a week. Jackson saw him out, then returned to stand before the fire, his expression unreadable. "The mares are fine," he said before she could ask. "All accounted for, no signs of early labor, though one of my best cottonwoods is now firewood." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. "I should have waited, or at least told Sarah exactly where I was going." "Yes, you should have." His voice was tight with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Do you have any idea what went through my mind when I returned early from the drive and Sarah told me you were out in that storm?" Eliza looked up, startled. "You came back early. Why?" Jackson's gaze flicked away, then back to her face. "Had a feeling. Call it a rancher's instinct about the weather." He paused, then added more quietly, "Or maybe I just couldn't stop thinking about a certain stubborn Eastern woman who's turned my well-ordered life upside down." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile as spider silk. Eliza's pulse quickened. "Jackson." He knelt beside the sofa, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "When Caroline and little Mary died, I swore I'd never put myself through that kind of pain again. Figured the ranch was enough, that I didn't need anything else." His voice grew rough. "Then you arrived, with your city manners and your determination to prove yourself, and suddenly the ranch didn't seem quite enough anymore." Eliza reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I didn't come west looking for love. And yet here we are." He turned his face slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I can't promise it'll be easy. This land demands everything you have to give, and then some. I'm stronger than I look." The smile that transformed his face made him suddenly devastatingly handsome. That, Eliza Morgan, I already knew. When he kissed her, it was with the same deliberate care he brought to everything he valued. Thorough, unhurried, as if memorizing every sensation. Eliza put her arms around his neck, drawing him closer, feeling the last walls between them crumble like dry earth after drought. The first snow of winter dusted Diamond R Ranch in a blanket of pristine white. From the porch of the main house, Eliza watched as Jackson and Thomas led a string of horses toward the barn, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. 3 months had passed since the storm that had changed everything. The cattle drive had been successful, bringing a handsome profit that Jackson had immediately reinvested in breeding stock and improvements to the ranch. The foals had been born healthy, adding 5 promising fillies to the Diamond R's growing reputation for fine horseflesh. And Eliza had found her place in this new world, not just as Thomas's sister or Jackson's sweetheart, but as a woman with her own strength and purpose. She had proven herself during the fall roundup, working alongside Sarah to feed the hungry crews, and had begun keeping the ranch's accounts with a precision that impressed even Jackson. The men spotted her on the porch and waved. Thomas continued to the barn with the horses, but Jackson detoured toward the house, his long strides eating up the distance between them. "Cold enough for you, city girl," he teased as he climbed the steps. "Hardly noticeable," she lied, huddling deeper into her shawl. He laughed and pulled her into the circle of his arms. "Liar. Your nose is red as a cherry. Perhaps you could warm it up," she suggested, tilting her face up to his. "Happy to oblige, ma'am." He kissed her soundly, his lips warm despite the chill air. When he drew back, his expression had grown serious. "Been thinking about something." "That sounds dangerous." "Might be." He took her hands in his. "This place needs a mistress, Eliza. A proper one, not just a housekeeper and a rancher's sweetheart." Eliza's breath caught. "Jackson Reed, are you asking me to marry you?" "Doing a poor job of it, apparently." His smile was self-deprecating. I'm not much for fancy words or grand gestures, but I love you, Eliza Morgan. Love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you've made this harsh land your own. I would be honored if you'd consent to be my wife." Joy bubbled up within her, as bright and unexpected as a desert spring. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." He kissed her again, this time with a passion that promised far more than merely warming her nose. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, he pressed his forehead to hers. "One condition," he murmured. "What's that?" "No more riding into thunderstorms alone. My poor old heart can't take it." Eliza laughed, the sound carrying across the snow-covered yard like music. "I promise. From now on, we face the storms together." Above them, the vast Wyoming sky stretched endlessly blue, a promise of horizons yet to be explored together.